Karl Marx lived during the Industrial Revolution. That means he witnessed an incredible increase in productivity with all this new industrial equipment. But he saw that at the cost of a lot of human suffering. During that time, children were put to work in not only unsafe but unhealthy conditions, working long hours. They weren't getting educated. And Marx is looking at this thinking, nobody takes delight in seeing children suffer and seeing people living in squalor. And so he wondered, how in the world did we get into this place of being able to produce so much stuff, more than ever before, and yet the result is poverty and suffering. This bothered him, and he figured there's got to be a better way. And so, as a social scientist, and by the way, Marx did not like to be thought of as a philosopher, he liked to be thought of as a scientist with his feet firmly planted on the ground. And so he writes his book Das Kapital, which is, of course, the capital, and it's his version of how society should be structured. And of course, that being communism, and that's why he's referred to as the father of communism. Well, of course, we've seen how Marx, especially in the United States, gets a bad name because we've seen the abysmal failure of modern communist states when it comes to, of all things, human rights. And so you got to wonder what's up with this dichotomy and how'd this happen and what was Marx's real intent. Well, let's take a look at who Marx was. He studied Hegel. Hegel was a big philosopher at the time, and Hegel was an idealist, meaning he felt that truth is found in the world of ideas. And Hegel had said that this quote right here, that materialism will never be able to show mathematical laws of human development. Marx did his doctoral thesis basically on materialism, or we should say atomism, because his thesis was on what we refer to as the atomists, the first guys to speculate that the whole world is made up of tiny, imperceptible things that we refer to as atoms, or a thing, atoms. And so he was well versed in this idea of materialism. Materialism saying there is no such thing as a non-physical realm or a spiritual realm. There is only the physical realm. So there's no such thing as God or spirits or anything that you would attribute to being non-physical. Everything, according to the materialist, is made up of matter, made up of molecules and atoms, and therefore potentially all events are explainable in terms of cause and effect of matter. Well, so what Hegel is saying here is humans don't fit nicely into that idea of just being made up of atoms. We seem to have a spirit, we have ideas, and there's no laws that can predict, he's saying right here, that can predict human behavior, or that can sort of plot out what human beings do, because we make choices. We volitionally decide to do things, unlike atoms that have no mind to make choices. They must just bounce around according to the laws of nature. Well, human beings, Hegel says, are not that way. We make decisions, and so you'll never be able to have mathematical, scientific laws that show what human beings are going to do. Well, as Marx came into his own, he departed from this, and he wants to say, oh, yes, you can. You can predict human behavior, just like anything else in nature. When you look at a of a herd of wildebeest, while you may not be able to predict the movements of a single wildebeest, you can very accurately predict the movements of the entire herd according to eating behaviors, mating behaviors, weather patterns, and so on and so forth. And he says, and the human beings are no different. Human behavior can be explained with determined scientific laws. All right, well, why engage in this? Well, he was, like many philosophers before him, engaged in this idea of the problem of history. That's where you look back at where we've been historically and you try to understand what events led to what events, which led to which events, in order to get a handle on the trajectory of where we're headed to see where we're going to land. And if we don't like where we're headed, what can we do about it? How can we change things? Marx is looking at what had happened as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and he's saying we need to tweak this thing or we're going to implode. Well, he starts off with some very basic assumptions. The first being, and he gets this from Hegel, that progress is always the result of struggle. So what this means is progress, using the term loosely, by progress we mean any significant social change, is always the result of struggle, of friction, of tension, of a war, as it were, of some kind. And that this is evidenced in nature, a pride of lions, and there is one male lion that is king of the pride, right? And how did he get there? Well, through natural selection, he was able to fight off any other competing males, and by being the strongest, then this strongest example of the species then breeds with the females to increase the strength of the entire pride. So there's always this fighting that goes on to create a new thing. Well, this is all encompassed in a wider idea from Hegel, which is the dialectical or dialectical materialism in Marx's case. To understand this idea, in terms of dialectical, think of the word dialogue, and materialism, think of matter. So that within the very structure of matter in the universe, there's this kind of dialogue going on, this back and forth, a well, not a yin and yang so much or polarities, but rather that everything that exists has its opposite that it must interact with, which produces a new thing. And this is the dialectical. And that new thing then has some sort of opposite that it must interact with to produce a new thing. The thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So he says, and this is something that is happening on a molecular level and happening out in the cosmos amongst the stars. It's just throughout the whole thing. You might think of a pendulum, but not a stationary pendulum, but one that's floating in space, as it were. And as it swings, it moves about and goes in different directions in a three-dimensional space rather than in one fixed space going back and forth between two extremes. Each swing takes it to a new place from which it swings again. Well, this is sort of the idea of dialectical materialism, and it was very important to Marx because he felt that as you're studying social patterns and progress amongst human beings, you have to understand that this dialectic is always in play. Well, Marx, now, as we turn to his theory, Marx believed that economics determined the direction of history, not bright and brilliant ideas or beliefs or inspiring people. No, it's, as far as Marx is concerned, it's always the economics. The means, economics means the system used within any group of people to trade the stuff they need to survive in life. So, very generally, we're not having to study complex economic theory here so much as understand that Marx believes that what we are about in life is surviving and getting the stuff we need to survive. And even though that whole system becomes more and more complex, it all boils down to basically that. And that all struggles are economic struggles, or as he would put it, class struggles, because the classes are defined by economics. Well, as we saw with lions how power continually concentrates, so does the power amongst human beings, which is basically money, which represents our time and energy. Money continually concentrates into fewer and fewer hands, as we can see in this pie chart here, where we see that 43% of the financial wealth is held by 1% of the population, and so on and so forth. And Marx is saying this doesn't happen because this top percent of people that own all the money are such horrible, selfish people. He's saying this will happen no matter where you are on planet Earth. If there's a group of people, they will experience this phenomenon of money concentrating into fewer and fewer hands. Nobody means anything by it. It's just the way things are, and we need to be aware of it. All right, so he refers to these wealthy people as the bourgeoisie. And why do these people have all the money? Well, Marx says it's because they own the tools and machines. They own the tools and machines, which he refers to as the means of production. They own all the things that make the stuff. So if you're in a complex society. So if you're going to have stuff to survive, you got to have these tools with which to make it. And that's what Marx claims makes human beings so unique, is the fact that we make stuff. We modify the environment to accommodate our needs. So he doesn't refer to us as Homo sapiens, sentient thinkers, but Homo Faber, like fabricate, maker, man the maker. Human beings make stuff, and this is deep within our soul. We need to make stuff. It's our nature. And so in a broader sense, what he's saying is each person has this deep-seated human need to contribute to the group. Well, he will go on to demonstrate, as you read through Marx, the problem of labor. You see, labor evolves from people, all the working people, the proletariat, he calls them. Labor slowly evolves into just another tool in the means of production. So human beings, they're nice to have, they're very, very efficient, and they can get things done, but this problem, individual human beings don't show up to work, they get sick and die, they rebel. There's what we would really like for workers are robots. And with the Industrial Revolution, what you get is the input of human beings being whittled down to simple jobs in an assembly line, so that you become less dependent on the skills of any one individual, and you turn your labor force into a tool, basically. Not human beings, but tools in the means of production, making stuff. Well, this is a problem, Marx says, that he refers to as alienated labor. What you've done is you may have become more productive, by treating human beings this way. But all these people in the assembly line and these sweatshops and so forth are alienated from the things that they make. They can't say these folks here can't say I made a pair of shoes. All they can say is I put the laces on, or I glued the bottom on, or something like this. They don't have that sense of having accomplished anything. And so deep within them, they are still feeling, according to Marx, basically unfulfilled. And many people then begin to feel like this is an assault on their very humanity. So that is how economics determine the direction of history, is that, you get this growing group of folks that become disenchanted and unsatisfied and frustrated, that becomes the antithesis to the thesis of this productive economic system, and you have a class war which brings about social change of one kind or another, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. Well, so where do we go from here? And according to Marx, the answer is communism. And how does he see that? Well, he says the problem is letting people own things. People don't need to privately own things the way John Locke suggested. He says that is, in fact, why power begins to distill into fewer and fewer hands, is because people own tools. Everyone should own all the tools. Everyone should have as much right to life and liberty as anyone else. And the way to ensure that is to get rid of private ownership. Once you do that, then you can get rid of wages, which are always used to manipulate workers. Don't have wages, just distribute to everyone according to their needs. Each one according to their needs, and from each one according to their abilities, according to Marx. Of course, we've seen that it never quite worked out that way, and Marx wasn't naive himself. He knew that there were a lot of things that would stand in the way of realizing true communism. The first being that religion is a big problem. Religion is the opiate of the people. Opium, killing the pain. Religion tells you that you don't need to worry about your hard working conditions and your poverty, because after all, we're only here for a short period of time. Don't worry about your conditions in the here and now. And of course, that's Marx's sort of satirical take on this. As a materialist, he sees that the world as having no room for God, and that this is just an endemic problem of religion. To get rid of private ownership, it's going to require a bloody revolution. There's no way of getting around that. People aren't just going to turn over their stuff. It's going to require a revolution. But he really truly believed that if you can have the goal of the revolution be a communist state as the consequence, well, that you could bring around something good, supposedly. Well, as we said earlier, that hasn't quite panned out. And of course, we'd have to wonder why. I mean, Marx is pretty accurate in his assessment of history, but it's when he turns and looks toward the future and begins to speculate as to what should we do with this information. His prescription of a communist state is still struggling in terms of how to flesh it out in the real world. So we'd have to look at some of his basic assumptions and wonder maybe is the problem there or where. But at any rate, that is Marxism, and a very quick assessment of Karl Marx, the father of communism.